Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to say today we have Dr. Rakib Ehsan, who written an awesome book that I definitely recommend reading, Beyond Grievance, why the left gets wrong, what the left gets wrong about ethnic minorities. So it's a brilliant book. Dr. Rakib, thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me, Sunil. Really appreciate it.
So, before we get into the book, it'd be great for the audience to learn a bit more about yourself. Where you're from, your family, your upbringing, and
Sure.
sort of get an understanding of who Dr. Rakib is.
No, sure. So, all started off when I was born in Hammersmith back in April 1990, but we weren't there for long. Moved to Luton just after my first birthday, and I've lived here all my life ever since. People will tell you that Luton does not have the greatest reputation. It is the town where the English Defence League was formed, following the Butchers of Basra demonstrations, which made the national news. So it is a town that's had its fair share of issues when it comes to Islamist extremism and also far right extremism. And I think, in a sense, being raised in the town during those tumultuous times, that really uh, generated this interest that I have, in a way, in social cohesion. How do we bring communities together through a civic mindedness, you could say? What are those kind of shared values, obligations, common purpose that can help to integrate our diverse communities in Britain? And it's something that ultimately inspired me to do my PhD, which investigated the impact of social integration on non-white ethnic minorities living in the UK. And I've very much continued to do that sort of work. And is those kind of themes that really come to the fore in my new book, Beyond Grievance.
What's amazing with a lot of the work that you've done, just following you on Twitter and in your book is you don't follow the normal trend of somebody who's had with your academic background
Mm,
in terms of the things you say. It's very different from what you hear about people who have the history, the academics in social cohesion on TV and stuff.
mm.
So it'd be before again we dive into the book, because I know I'm touching a bit onto
No,
the
of course.
introduction here. What made you sort of shape your views, and what's made you shape the way you've written this book? Because it is about the left, what they've got wrong about ethnic minorities. I'm guessing you've got that from your studies, from your PhD and your general research.
No, of course, absolutely. I'm a researcher by trade, and many of the liberal left narratives that I see being peddled about different ethnic minority communities living in the UK is simply not rooted in reality, Sunil. That's the truth of it. I actually feel that the realities on the ground are far more positive than much of what's actually being reported. We'll talk about this more, I'm sure. But I think that the central message of the book is that there are many successful, thriving ethnic minority communities in the UK who are appreciative of the opportunities, freedoms, and protections provided under British democracy, and you see that in the wealth of survey data which exists. So I do think much of the liberal left, and this is something that we'll definitely tuck into more as the conversation progresses, but I think there's elements of the British left, Sunil, they draw inspiration from the United States and the American racial identity politics, a country that has a vastly different history, a vastly different national context. In my view, a relatively youthful experiment, which is very much struggling with the legacy of slavery and segregation. Segregation, very recent forms of racial segregation as well. So in the UK, what I call for is an equality agenda, which is very much focused on the UK, not looking to draw inspiration from different national contexts, and practical action. The vast majority of ethnic minority people living in the UK think we've made significant strides when it comes to racial equality, but significant majority also feel that there is more work to be done. For example, when you look at the labour market, there's a wealth of CV-based studies which show that if you have a traditionally English sounding name, you are at more of an advantage in those recruitment processes associated with the labour market compared to people who may have a culturally distant name, perhaps Rakib Ehsan or Sunil Sharma. So I wouldn't say I look at the country through rose-tinted spectacles. I think there are improvements to be made, but I also think that if you really want to draw different groups together and you want to have that to take place, you have to also acknowledge the fantastic progress that we have made on matters of race and equality.
Let's dive into this. So, we talked about the amazing strive that you've seen in terms of racial equality getting better. So, if we go into, if you like, the introduction bit of your book, your background, your sort of family history, your parents, it'd be good to get an understanding, because I'm sure that played a massive role in your in this book and your thought process as well as the research. So, when you were obviously born, from my understanding, to Bangladeshi parents who from there moved to England. What was that like, and when did you start to see, if you like, the improvements in Bangladeshi community, Indian community? When did you start to see those improvements?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that if you look at the separate ethnic groups, British Indians traditionally are more settled. I think that you saw notable forms of settlement into the UK in the 1950s. You had medical professionals coming from Gujarat in Western India. You also had people from the Punjab relocating to the UK as well. But Bangladeshis, in comparison, are more recently arrived. The more recent form of Indian origin migration, if you can call it that, was following the expulsion of East African Asians under Idi Amin's aggressive processes of Africanization, where their businesses and properties were confiscated and then redistributed to his cronies. Ugandan Indians in particular are nothing but a fantastic national success story, many bringing their business knowledge and entrepreneurial spirit to the UK, which really allowed them to integrate very well economically, socially, and culturally. But I think in terms of the improvements made, if I just talk about British Bangladeshis in particular, I think much of that, if you look in the younger generations, is because their institutions in East London have improved. As you know, there's a heavy concentration of British Bangladeshis in the eastern boroughs of London, and the schooling standards have improved. And if you combine that with migrant parents who may not necessarily be well educated themselves, but believe that they want their children to make the most of those fantastic opportunities offered to them by a state-funded school system, and you combine that with targeted forms of investment in London. I know that there are Teach First programs, the London Challenge, which have actually helped aspirational teachers who really want to make a difference in inner city areas. I think that that's really made a positive difference to the life of many British Bangladeshis. And you see now, if you actually look at the recent levels of school attainment, British Bangladeshis are now outperforming the white British mainstream. So I think that that's quite a remarkable development.
That leads really well on to the first chapter of the book, where you talk about why the left should drop white privilege theories.
Indeed.
And it was interesting. I knew I'd seen stats for Chinese people, Indians, who were outperforming traditional British white people in schooling systems. But what was fascinating in your book is I learned that there's even more ethnic groups that are outperforming British white people, even in jobs and lots of different, not just education. So that was really interesting to read. How did you come to the white privilege theory in terms of why is this a chapter in your book in terms where you've obviously, it's the first one that we talk about why the left should drop. Why was that so prevalent to talk about?
Because I think much of it is bonkers, Sunil, if truth be told. I think that I see white privilege theories being the talk of the town in many left-leaning circles in the UK. And I think that's hugely problematic for the Labour Party in particular. Because if you look at many of the communities that they lost, traditionally Labour voting communities, they are predominantly white British, but anything but privileged. And I think that if you draw inspiration from, how do I describe it, US-style intersectionality, and under these intersectional frameworks, the white male is seen as the epitome of advantage and privilege. If you look at the educational outcomes, for example, it's white working class boys that are lagging considerably behind their peers. So I think in a way, intersectionality can allow you to identify those differences. I just want that to be done in the British context, not brainlessly being imported from the US. And I think more generally, I know this is very controversial territory, Sunil, but we know that our country has experienced a number of grooming gang scandals, where cases primarily involving men of Pakistani Muslim heritage and victims largely underaged white working class girls. And people even talk about, oh, but you can't really be racist towards white people because of power dynamics, structures of oppression, all the rest of it. Where's the white privilege in that particular situation, where you had public institutions ultimately prioritizing racial and religious sensitivities over protecting the very most vulnerable in society? There wasn't much white privilege to be had there. So I think these theories, I'd call them pseudo-intellectual theories, they don't really allow us to understand the realities of modern day Britain. And I think one of the central elements of the book, you could say, is that I talk about the importance of family structure. I talk about socioeconomic class. Class doesn't get talked about very much in left-wing circles nowadays, interestingly, and actually make the point that racial identity politics actually fragments shared working class concerns, which can span different races, ethnicities, and faiths. I also talk, it's either the level of trust in your local neighborhood can be an important shaper of life chances. Now, they may not sound as fashionable, culturally fashionable, as emphasizing the so-called importance of racial identity, but I think these are very important life shapers which need to be taken into account when you're designing social policy, which hopefully should make a meaningful difference when it comes to the lives of young people living in the UK.
I would, my follow-up question, but I think you've kind of answered it, is why it was important to have that in the book, that chapter. And I think you've answered right there with the grooming gangs. I think you're referring to what happened in Rotherham, where there was hundreds of girls that were sexually abused, but because of police just being overly sensitive over racial matters, they didn't end up prosecuting or actually going forward with the cases. So I think that's really, I think when often, I'm sure you probably had it a lot, where people are asking, why are you focusing on these sort of things? There's much more important things. That wasn't a great example, an unfortunate example of why your book and that chapter in particular was really, really important.
No, absolutely. And I think that I'm very unapologetic when I come to making this point. I think that one of the greatest advantages you can have in life is belonging to a stable and loving family unit. And I think that when you look at, for example, the rates of lone parent households by ethnic group, and I'd firstly make this point that there are many single parents in the country that do a fantastic job in terms of trying to raise their children in a good and proper way. But the reality is, and that there's research which shows this, is that a two-parent household spearheaded by a married couple is more strongly associated with positive youth outcomes, whether that's level of school attainment, cognitive development, mental well-being, life satisfaction. And when you look further down life stages, socioeconomic integration, labor market integration in adult life. So I think that we really need to make that point. And then when you look at the rates of lone parent households, in the white British mainstream, the rate is 19%, nearly 1 in 5 children up to the age of 15 years. That rises to 63% for their peers of Black Caribbean origin, which is quite an astonishing figure. For their peers of Indian origin, it drops down to 6%. For Bangladeshi origins, 12%, Pakistani origin, 14%. So I think that shows that if you're talking about one of the greatest advantages in life, belonging to a two-parent household, which is strong, particularly associated with positive youth outcomes, there are a number of ethnic minority communities which are actually a greater advantage than the white British mainstream, which is why I think that when you're looking at these notions of white privilege, not necessarily helpful when it comes to understanding modern day British society.
I think I couldn't agree more. And what's interesting when you go on every single stat with two parents versus one, even if you're going to poverty, they're more likely to
Absolutely.
poverty, jail, every extreme that you can think of, you're largely better. And I think sometimes because we see extreme examples of people who have come from
Indeed.
one parent household and stuff, and they've been ultra successful. And that, obviously, it can happen, but
Of
the
course.
likelihood is, like you said with the stats, is the likelihood is if you are in a two-parent household, you're much more likely to have a better life in every single aspect. So it's very interesting to mention. And I want to touch on the 63% when we talked about Black Caribbeans being raised in a single parent household, because you talk about it in the book a lot about BLM and the impact of the BLM movement, the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK. I remember the early stages of this happening, and I couldn't understand how what happened in America translated here into UK, and that we were having such wide discussions about it. If you could touch upon that, because your book does explain that in some detail on how that has translated from the US to the UK, because I think a lot of people don't understand why we have such discussions about that movement and how it translated to here.
I think what we're seeing, Sunil, is that we see this proliferation of anti-system narratives. And what they're designed to do is to deflect attention away from very real internal cultural problems within minority communities. And I think there's certainly a debate to be had in terms of police community relations in inner city London, even though I do think when you look at the Windrush scandal, for example, I think that's inevitably done a great deal of damage when it comes to levels of institutional trust within Black Caribbean communities. These are all very real problems. I think the Met is too big to succeed. I actually argue in the book that it should be broken down into smaller sized police forces, or maybe the outer boroughs are absorbed into existing forces such as Kent, Essex, along with other police forces. But when you're looking at the stats on family stability, there's no doubt in my mind that there are many young Brits of Black Caribbean origin. They are at a disadvantage because of that. And I really make this point, Sunil, that if you don't have that sense of belonging and that feeling of stability at home, then you're going to seek that feeling of belonging elsewhere. And quite often that can take you into particularly dark territory, including gang membership. Once you're a member of a gang, your chances of engaging in unlawful activity and ultimately being involved with the criminal justice system increases. So if we're looking at knife crime in London, for example, we have to go to the very root of it. And I think much of that is because in certain communities, there's a lack of responsible male role models in the household. And if you think this is a controversial point, this was the very same point made by a certain David Lammy after the 2011 London riots. So I think that we really need to have an honest discussion about family instability and its impacts. We also need to provide a positive account of responsible fatherhood. And I think quite often we have these talks about toxic masculinity and all the rest of it. But I think we really have to champion responsible fathers who make their living in an honest and legitimate way, and they have a very strong family first philosophy.
I think one of the things that's definitely, it seems to me, a massive, it's almost like the death of masculinity. It just doesn't seem to really exist, and I don't think we promote it in any sort of way. And like, if you remotely do talk about men in this sort of role, fathers, it becomes, like you said, toxic masculinity. I think that becomes, as opposed to actually encouraging men to want to be fathers, good husbands, and all this sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
But I want to touch on how this has happened. So, you do talk about it in the book in sense, David Lammy is a really good example of somebody who said those things in 2011, very rational, logical things that he was talking about. And then now fast forward into 2023, you would never hear him say something like that.
Very likely.
Why has that happened? Why have we seen such a big shift on the left? And why is it a controversial thing to say now when it wasn't, let's say, even maybe 10 years ago?
I think, truthfully, if you look at David Lammy in particular, who's probably one of my favorite politicians, uh, when I was a lot younger, I think that his political career stalled somewhat. And I think this is kind of the point that people indulge in racial identity politics because it's out there and it can give you a sense of status and relevance within your particular circles, social and political circles. And I think that's a crying shame. I think that with Labour in particular, and if you could call it the contemporary British left, I think the very growth of the internet in itself has been not the greatest development for left-wing British politics, because what's happened, the British left has become increasingly connected with the American left, um, and you have that sort of information exchange, the sharing of ideas, and a lot of those ideas are problematic. And when those ideas are imported in the UK to the point where British BLM protesters are chanting "Don't shoot" at British police officers who are largely unarmed and support that model of policing, I think it really shows you that there's a grave intellectual deficit at the heart of left-wing British politics. I also feel that, in a sense, I think the UK, as I've said before, has made fantastic progress on matters of race relations more broadly. You have many privileged middle class leftist activists. They're almost ashamed of their privilege and they want to attach themselves to social justice causes, some to the point that they cosplay as 1960s American civil rights activists fighting segregation. I find it quite tragic, really, if truth be told. If you're privileged, just acknowledge it. You don't have to go in this sort of identitarian grievance overdrive, which I think that we've seen on the British left. So I think there's various dynamics at play. I think actually some people are very insecure over their class privilege, you could say, and I think they try to use they try to use their racial identity politics, or rather attaching themselves to social justice causes, to deflect attention away from their privilege, if truth be told. And I think that's hugely problematic. But I think more generally, what I want to see practical action. And I think that when it comes to anti-racist politics in the UK, I think that you see there's elements of the anti-racist movement which has actually taken a deeply sinister turn. And I'd really make this point: if you really care about young Black lives in modern day Britain, you have to talk about the fatherlessness epidemic in inner city communities in London. I think if you want to overlook that, then I think that you're doing the entire conversation a fundamental disservice.
You mentioned it there a bit, and in terms of people looking for belonging and identity and all that stuff, really interesting in your book is the chapter on power of faith. I found that very interesting because it's something that I've toyed with quite a lot in terms of trying to often, I keep asking, why do we have such a woke culture? It's kind of accepted now, people we've gone too far on lots of things, and I've constantly toyed with that. Why is this happening? How has this happened? Why we're in the situation that we are in the trans debates, it could be Uncle Ben's rice going to just Ben's, right? Like it could be the smallest thing, big things. Why is it constantly? I don't understand where this come from. And what's really interesting in your book is the conversation about the lack of faith amongst people in this country.
Sure.
Do you think that's played a part in terms of some of this, people talking about white privilege and all this other sort of stuff?
I think you make a point, Sunil, there. I think you make a good point. There's no doubt there's been a rapid secularization of the white British mainstream in particular. I think in the space of 20 years, the level of Christian identification has dropped from over 70% to below half in England and Wales. I think it's in the region of 46, 47% based on the latest census figures. I think what was really interesting, I'm sure that you saw this, there was a Westminster Abbey service marking 75 years of the NHS. And I think if there's anything that could encapsulate the decline of Christian devotion and almost this kind of almost a worshipping of an underperforming behemoth in the shape of the NHS, a healthcare system where levels of public satisfaction are at an all-time low, that would be it. And I think that more generally people say woke is a religion. You hear that being peddled quite a lot. But I think what it is, in the absence of wholesome attachments to faith, I still make that point that people may seek forms of belonging elsewhere. And I think, in a sense, people join these social justice causes, and many of them feel that they're genuinely doing a great a deal of great social work, almost, if you could call it that, in terms of, educating the rest of us on how Britain is a fundamentally racist hellscape, how there's significant improvements that need to be made on matters of discrimination and equality. And I simply offered this view that I think there are improvements to be made, but I think much of this ultimately results in an unfair vilification of modern day Britain. So I'd even make the point, I've seen the way people protect white privilege theories. It's verging on dogmatic. It reminds me of almost religious radicals, in a sense, who can't even acknowledge that there may well be legitimate criticisms of their ideology. And I just think that even when you present people with the evidence, that, well, actually, some of these theories are quite suspect. They're not especially applicable to the modern day British context. The degree to which people defend them and start talking about oppressive structures, power dynamics, these very abstract concepts, it is very dogmatic in my view.
And so again, I'll go back to one of my sort of earlier questions. But why is this again so important? Because we talked about a really big example is the grooming gangs that happened with all those young children were sexually assaulted, and why else is this really important? Because again, I'm sure you've had this a lot from people on the left. I'm sure people even in center, right, whatever. Who would have asked there's more important things going on. Like why do we push your time and energy on something like this? What for you keeps you driving to finish this book off, to keep talking about it, to keep pushing this sort of thing? Why do you think it's so important that we have these discussions?
I think it's important because I think that if you take pride in your national identity, you shouldn't tolerate your country being vilified on very important issues. And the reality is, race, for better or worse, is at the moment is an integral part of our national political discourse. In my view, I don't think that should necessarily be the case. When it comes to the provision of anti-discrimination protections on the grounds of race, ethnicity, and religion, post-Brexit UK outperforms France, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, and Italy. I think in terms of our race relations, we're in far better shape than the United States, for example. But we are most certainly an international hotspot when it comes to family breakdown. So I'd actually like the family to be talked a lot more in our politics. And I think that at times the family has been a non-topic in our national politics. That's the truth of it. So I think, in a sense, that if you really tackle these issues and you demonstrate to people that actually things are a lot better than they actually are, than they're actually being portrayed, rather, by particular activists on the British left, then we can focus on very real issues at hand. In the middle of a cost of living crisis, which impacts on people across a variety of races, ethnicities, and faiths, why is Labour proposing a Race Equality Act? And I think that in a country where we have stubbornly high rates of family breakdown, I actually think that we need to be talking more about introducing a Family Stability Act. Now, how can we reshape our labour market, welfare state, and British life more broadly in a more family friendly way? How can we improve our investments in communities which are most at risk of family breakdown, or they've had traditionally high levels of family disintegration? Also, how can we create an economy where we have very important forms of local economic regeneration, which creates apprenticeships, improves education systems, creates apprenticeships, well-paid jobs in local communities, so young people who want to stay there don't have to move to a totally different part of the country, away from their family. So if you do that, you preserve important forms of intergenerational connection, and those bonds are sustained. I think those are the kind of discussions we should be having, as opposed to obsessing over matters of race.
But definitely, having you could even go so simplistic with the cost of living crisis. Living in a family, living with two parents, in a much better financial position than a single person living by themselves, having
Very
to
likely, yeah.
provide for their child. So you could even make it as simple as that. And going
Absolutely.
back to the sort of family dynamic, before we move on to the next parts of the book, how has that been received on people on the left? Because, for example, I talk similar to what you're talking about, family with people within the Conservative Party, and even that sometimes can raise eyebrows, and even now it's not necessarily. People would say it's almost I'm being too conservative, even on the Conservative side. How is that? I can imagine the response is probably a bit worse for you on when you're talking about it with maybe left-wing colleagues or friends. What's the response been like when you talk about family? Because it has become politicized. It's no longer just I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, people would say it's better to be raised in two-parent households. It's good for the children, good for I think that wasn't a political dynamic. It wasn't Republican, Democrat, Labour, Conservative. It definitely seems like that now. So how is it received on people that when you talk about this sort of stuff?
Well, I think it's a point that I make in the book, that the Conservative Party is conservative in name only. And it comes as no surprise to me when you're having these kind of conversations of the importance of family stability, that you do face your fair share of, how do you call it, cultural hesitancy to engage with those points within the Conservative Party. And there's no secret, there's a socially liberal faction within the Conservative Party that's very non-traditional in its worldview, if I could put it that way. There are left-wing colleagues who think that the family is a overly hierarchical institution. It blunts the innovation and creativity of young people and all the rest of it. Now, I'm not going to romanticize two-parent family units, and I think in particular communities there are discussions to be had in terms of how younger women are, how they're encouraged to make headway educationally and economically. And I think I do mention those points in the book as well. But I think in life there needs to be a degree of order and stability to allow young people to flourish. And I think the question is what is the kind of family structure which best allows for that? So I think that there are those on the left, and I think it's largely it's also because I do think there are people on the left, many who are younger professionals, professional city dwellers, who I do feel sorry for them, because much of their income is being spent renting in the cities. They have no real opportunity to save towards a home. And the reality is, I do think home ownership would allow younger people to have that opportunity to build a family. The reality is, you can't really build a family unless you have a family-friendly home to begin with. And I think, in a sense, some are very open about this, and they talk about, well, actually, I would love to get married and have a family of my own, but I don't know if the financial situation doesn't allow for that. But I also think you have people who, because they know that that's not a goal for them personally, they want to downplay the very importance of family structure, if that makes sense, because it's not a goal that they can reach themselves. They try to downplay the importance of it. I have more respect for those who say, actually, I'd love to have this. I'd love to have a family, get married, have a family of my own, be a father or mother, but I'm really struggling, whether it's purchasing a family-friendly home, being able to accrue those savings that can help towards a housing deposit. I think those are the kinds of activists on the left. I think they need to be given more of a hearing, if truth be told. You also have activists like this within the Conservative Party, by the way, and I think that they're doing a good job of articulating their views as well. But I think we really have to have a very serious conversation about why birth rates, for example, in the country have plummeted. Now, much of that is cultural. I think that's the truth of it. I think we need to have an honest debate about to what extent do people prioritize individual freedom over family-based responsibility. The reality of the matter is, if you want to build your own family, you want to get married, there has to be a degree of self-sacrifice involved in that. I think that you have to have an honest conversation about that. But I do think economics plays into it. I think that if you have a housing crisis, I think Centre for Cities published a fantastic report. So no, they're saying that we have a backlog of over 4 million homes. I mean, that's just remarkable. And I think in both the Conservatives, not just Conservatives and the Labour Party, I think it's something that spans a variety of political parties at local level. And NIMBYism is rampant. I think we have to be absolutely honest. Now, I love much of the scenery we have in our country. It's absolutely beautiful and that should be preserved. But some of the land that I've seen classified as greenbelt land territory, not the most aesthetically pleasing land, if truth be told. So I think that we really need to have. What was really interesting, both the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, they both come out with their 5 main pledges, which I'm sure you know about the 5 main pledges, each of them. Housing doesn't feature in either, which I think is absolutely remarkable. And I think that many young people would find that very dispiriting, and I think that's a real shame.
Yeah, I think housing is a massive problem, and the point about sort of declining birth rates is really interesting because for a long time there was this kind of belief that going through the 70s, 80s that we're having too many kids, and we as far as China doing the one child policy, and there was I've forgotten his name, a really good professor who talked about how the biggest change in birth rates is most people throughout history typically have 1 to 2 to 3 children. The difference was majority of the time your children wouldn't survive as medicine better and better. Indeed. And what made I think the 60s, 80s different from 60 years ago even is when you have your children, they all survive. So as opposed to when you have 6 in, let's say, the 1800s, only 3 typically would carry on to be adults. Now all 6 most likely will become adults. So we saw a massive boom in the 60s, 70s, 80s because they all survived. Parents were doing the same as their parents. That's changed. But what he talked about a lot was that we are declining. So although the population is going up and up, the actual rate is really sharply of people going down. And very soon we'll have a declining birth rate, and very soon we'll have a situation where we'll need to produce more children. It's very interesting to hear him saying. You're touching on the sort of the economics of it, the cultural things that are very interesting, and I'm sure that all plays a part in terms of the decline in birth rates. Do you think that's an attribute again when we're talking about the sort of, I'm not going to say lack of faith, but you mentioned it a bit there, like the lack of self-sacrifice. Do you think that plays a part, and maybe then kids nowadays or young adults not coming from 2-parent households and seeing the instability causes and thinking, I don't want to do the same, for a child. I don't see the benefit.
I think that's a fantastic point. I think naturally there is that possibility if you're raised in a unstable environment, you don't want that to be repeated later on in life. But that there are also many people who see that as a reason to really, correct the record. This is something that I went through. I'm going to do things very differently because I understand what I don't want. I've learned a lot from my early stages of life, and this is how I'm going to do things properly for my own family that I'm going to build for myself. So I think that more broadly, if you're looking at how society is structured, I think even social trust comes into it. Are you more willing to have children if you generally don't trust wider society? I think that's a point to be made. And I think the question is, there's a great deal of emphasis on individualism. Now, don't get me wrong. I talk in the book about personal responsibility, individual initiative. These are classically conservative principles. But I see it a bit differently. I'd say that I'm quite an ambitious person, and I have that individual drive and ambition. But that comes from largely I want to make my family proud. So that there's a family-based consideration there. The reason why I have that ambition is because my family, especially my mother, has invested so much time and energy in my development. I want to repay them by achieving a great deal and making them happy and proud. I also live in a community which is quite tight-knit. I have elders in the community always asking, back in the day, asking me, "Oh, how did you do in this exam? How are you doing at college? How you do? How are you progressing at university? How's work coming along?" You want to give them good news. So I think there's almost that kind of almost a healthy pressure.
Yeah.
Some people might say they find it quite overwhelming, but I think that healthy pressure helps you get on in life. It's almost a catalyst for you to progress as an individual. So I think in a way, individualism, the family, and community spirit, it's not that not only can they coexist. I think in a way they're fundamentally intertwined. In a way. But I think, of course, I think that when we're looking at what are the kinds of things that make people reluctant to start a family of their own or indeed get married, I think we have to talk about people's attitudes towards commitment. Now, in certain communities, I think that the idea of, you stick with that one person through thick and thin, that is your marital partner, and you aspire to only have children with that one person. The dynamic might be very different in other communities. If truth be told, in other communities, it's almost seen as a badge of honor if you have children from lots of different women. And I think that we need to call that out, if truth be told. So I think there's a variety of factors at play. I think, as you said, economics comes into it, social values, cultural attitudes. But I think what I'd like to see is that we just have conversations like this more often. I think that's the key, because I think many people think, oh, some of these topics are very sensitive. I don't want to be accused of anything here. But I think unless you don't have these conversations, you won't make any real progress.
I always completely agree. And I always joke with some of my colleagues and stuff that there's a lot of things I think if they say as white people, especially white males, I wouldn't dare to say the stuff you say or I say if I was them. I would never. I totally get why I would be one of those silent majorities, if you like. I would not sort of stuff. But there's a really interesting interesting part of your book even where chapter 5, 6, and 7 talks about Britain's ethnic minorities. So whether it's the patriots, democracy, academic and professional achievement. Now I'm going to start with the Britain's ethnic minority patriots. And I have to say that's probably one of my favorite chapters of your book. It's really, really interesting because for a long time I always thought there's not necessarily lots of people like me in terms of relatable, in terms of, I feel so patriotic about this country. Both my parents aren't born here; they're both born in India. I always felt like I felt so patriotic. I always felt so lucky to be born here. My life would have been nowhere near what it is now had I been raised where my parents were born. So I feel so grateful and lucky, and makes me want to be patriotic, help my community, be involved,
absolutely,
all the stuff. And it's a real cool fan. And what was so interesting is you said so many of these things, and you articulated a lot better than how I'm doing it within the book, and it was amazing to read. If you could touch a bit about that, I know I'm going had a bit personal in terms of with yourself when we talk about that particular chapter of how you see yourself as a patriot of this country.
Yeah, I think that there's many positives when you look at the patriotic sentiments that run deep in many ethnic minority communities, and I make the point in the book that I think that those patriotic sentiments are not necessarily well represented, especially when it comes to much of the modern Labour Party, but also left-leaning journalists and academics. In my view, there's no doubt, particularly with first-generation migrants who come from relatively unstable social environments, the widespread political corruption, a real lack of institutional trust, especially in the police, largely because of corruption and bribery. They naturally have positive orientations towards British democracy. And that's the truth of it, because Britain fares much better than their countries of origin over when it comes to a range of indicators, economic, social, cultural, and political. I think that more generally, I talk about Brexit in the book a fair bit. People are still amazed when I inform them that 1 in 3 ethnic minority Brits voted to leave the EU. They're even more amazed when I tell them that Luton voted to leave, because many people know that Luton is a non-white majority town. What I really like talking about is, I'm sure you're familiar with this area, Osterley and Spring Grove in Hounslow, West London. As you know, quite well to do, high rates of home ownership, very strong Indian origin presence. I think that's a non-white majority ward as well, actually. Voted leave 63.4%.
Amazing.
And I think that there's this idea that if you're like us two, we have an ethnic minority background, you have to subscribe to a particular set of liberal views on a variety of issues. In one would be immigration. Oh, you know, your parents were born outside the country. How can you be so conservative on matters of immigration? And I think what a lot of people miss is that under the EU freedom of movement, we almost had a biased immigration system where predominantly white EU migrants were the beneficiaries of preferential treatment under the freedom of movement principle. And I think more generally, it's quite bigoted in a way to argue that because you have an ethnic minority background, you can't feel protective over the country, whether it's the pace of social change that comes with immigration. Almost as if you're not truly British. I think that's the kind of message it sends. So you can actually see, in a sense, that there's an underlying bigotry there, which I really I think that I really tackle that in the book. And I think when it comes to these patriotic sentiments, a lot of people don't realize that many Asian origin families, they have links with the British Indian Army when you look at previous generations, and also the merchant navy as well. The reality is we had service people in the subcontinent, Indian subcontinent, in Africa and the Caribbean, that made very important contributions to the Allied victory, especially in World War II. So why wouldn't they feel patriotic? Why wouldn't they feel that they don't belong to their country? So I think that what was really interesting is that I've looked at many pieces. I've said that if Labour embrace patriotic expressions, the Union flag, or even worse, the St. George's flag in their view, that this would alienate ethnic minorities en masse. There's no evidence for that, Sunil. That's not shown in the survey data. What's really interesting is that I've done research which shows that non-white people are more likely to say that their British identity is an important part of their personal identity than white Brits. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. Some white Brits might ultimately have a very strong English, Welsh, Scottish identity. Their focus is more on the home nation as opposed to the wider Britain, you could say. But there is that underlying sort of self-hatred is a very strong term, but there's certainly people in the white mainstream who really struggle to see the best in Britain. And I think that whether it's Brexit or the Conservative Party repeatedly winning elections, we might not have much of a chance in the next one. Because of those political outcomes, it's almost, they feel resentful towards their own country. And I think that with many non-white Brits, they also acknowledge that, and ultimately they will see themselves and they will understand they're a member of a racial, ethnic, and quite often a religious minority as well. And what was really interesting, I'll make this final point. There's a really great report recently published by British Future, which is spearheaded by Sundar Katwala. And they found that 80% of ethnic minority Brits believe that life as a minority, as a member of minority, is better in the UK when compared to France, Germany, and the United States. 80%. And as you know, there's many ethnic minority families in Britain. They also have family in those countries. France, Germany, other parts of Europe. Also, the United States would be quite a common one. Also in Australasia, Australia, New Zealand. And I'm sure that within these wider international family networks, that they'll talk about these kind of issues and they'll have an understanding of one another's lives in those different countries. So I think they're actually very well positioned to make that judgment in a sense. So I think there's plenty of positives when it comes to looking at how ethnic minorities relate to their own democracy. There are improvements to be made in terms of how public institutions perform and how they manage diversity, but they're very clearly, the vast majority have reached the view that if there is one country that would genuinely take seriously when it comes to that would take seriously the matter of improving equality of opportunity and racial equality, it would be Britain.
Well, the flag comment, if you go to my parents' house during any of the Queen's recent Platinum Jubilees or the King's, you'll never see more British flags
Absolutely.
over the house. But and the talking on Brexit, what's interesting is not too far from me. I live in Maidenhead, but not too far is Slough, and they voted leave, and that is a non-white predominantly area. So not non-white, more I think more of a, I don't know the exact right term, the more non Brits than people born in Britain. So whether it's Polish people, Romanians, Slough voted leave, and that's a very good example.
Yeah.
That really, what I found very interesting, and you talked about Osley and other places. What I found surprising and almost a bit sad is that not enough people did this analysis, not enough people talked about those areas and didn't ask necessarily questions, even if they weren't sure why do these things happen. Instead, it became very quite a divisive. I felt from the media in particular, just very much, you voted Brexit, you must be racist and blah blah, and all this, as opposed to digging in deeper into.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think your book does kind of answer some of these questions with the ethnic minorities, and another really important chapter is the ethnic minorities and democracy. And you touched upon it just now, where we do live in a thriving democracy, and I think a lot of ethnic minorities that their parents or immigrants have come from these countries really value how amazing our democracy is. If you could touch a bit on that, and then we can finish off on the final chapter.
No, absolutely. I think that when you look at our democracy, and I don't look at the country through rose-tinted spectacles. I mean, I've talked about actually breaking the Met, which is actually quite a radical proposal. I think when it comes to the NHS, I think it could be more dynamic, more efficient, more responsive when it comes to responding to the needs of an ever-diversifying population. We've already talked about labour market discrimination earlier in our conversation, Sunil. So I think there are improvements to be made, and I want to see practical action in those spheres of British life. But I think more broadly, if you look at our democracy, we are a land where there are many thriving ethnic minority communities. Another stat that people find remarkable is that 3 in 4 British Muslims think that Britain is a good place to live as a Muslim. I think that many people, when they hear that stat, they're shocked by it. And I think that we have to ask why. Why is that the case? It was very interesting. That was a Crest Advisory survey, which found that figure drops when non-Muslims are asked the same question, whether they think Britain is a good place to live as a Muslim. So in a sense, if you're non-Muslim, you're more likely to think that the country is anti-Muslim when compared to a British Muslim. So I think that in a way, and I think this is something that I think you probably agree with me, Britain is a land of unrepresentative group interests. You have a lot of these organizations and associations. I almost felt their preservation rests on peddling a particular picture of Britain, which is not especially positive nor optimistic. Their preservation rests on it. Dare I say, their financial security rests on it. And for me, I think that they're a direct threat to social cohesion and community relations. I really do. Because they not only they indulge in the vilification of modern day Britain, they don't actually not very interested in providing practical proposals to improve the situation either. System broadly, we have, and if you could allow me to talk about recent events in France, because I think this is quite important. I think secular universalism. There's a core constitutional principle of secularism, laicite, so-called colorblind egalitarianism. But in reality, that's not the greatest way to manage diversity in a modern European country, because with that colorblind egalitarianism, it's bred a mainstream cultural reluctance to acknowledge very real forms of racial and religious discrimination, because it's such a puritanical commitment to protecting the indivisible republic. Don't want to emphasize that there are cases of discrimination based on racial and religious minority identity in France. And I think that that aggressive form of secularism is incompatible with the very existence. Okay, there may well be the argument that there's a obsession with matters of race in particular, but where Britain is far better positioned on these issues is that I do think there's a genuine national effort to engage with issues of discrimination. In my view, we do collect data on the basis of race and ethnicity to see where where are those problems and where do they lie within particular ethnic groups. There's real reluctance to do that in France. So I think that the UK, another advantage the UK has relatively flexible labour markets, which facilitates economic activity among newly arrived migrants in particular, and that in turn can lead to positive forms of social integration. Well, I think that the French labour market is a bit sclerotic and inefficient in that sense. So I think that when it comes to looking at these kind of issues, in Britain, we have this, if you could call it this multicultural integrationist model, which is far from perfect, by the way. But if you look at a number of studies, whether it's trust in democratic institutions, trust in law and order institutions, trust in civil society, along with having this wholesome feeling of this sense of national belonging and altruistic attitudes and behaviors towards fellow citizens, Britain is far better positioned than France. And I think that should be appreciated, and I think that needs to be recognized.
Definitely. And I think there's some really good points there, and especially, it's just not talked about a lot in terms of how well we've done as a country with racial matters. It just doesn't seem to ever. It just seems about how, when we're talking media-wise in general, how bad the situation is. And you've rightly pointed out throughout this podcast some of the things that we could definitely improve on as a country.
Absolutely.
Which is really, really good to hear. And I think that kind of wraps things up nicely. And the final chapter is about you pushing towards a more relevant traditional left. And I think you've given lots of suggestions throughout the book and even in this podcast. What does that look like for you? Again, I urge people to actually read, because you said it's like with the book, but to those who haven't read the book yet, or to those who are going to at some point, how would you summarize pushing towards a more relevant traditional life? Because you highlight in the book, there's a very good chance that we will be looking at a Labour government coming up in the next year or so. What should that look like, and how do you want that to shape Britain?
Well, firstly, Sunil, if we're talking about a politics of equality in Britain, it shouldn't draw inspiration from the toxic racial identity politics in the United States, nor the uncompromising secular universalism in France. It needs to be British specific. It needs to take into account our own specific national history, heritage, and current day circumstances. I think that's key. I think that if we're very serious about talking about young people's development, and I think that any social democratic party should be interested in the well-being and development of its young people, then it has to engage with the matter of family structure and the well-being of communities more widely. I think that's really important. I think simply obsessing over race is insufficient when it comes to designing effective social policy in this country. I also feel that I increasingly see the term equity. We saw a report on the state of English and Welsh cricket recently, which used the term equity. Quite interestingly, included George Floyd in the foreword, which I think really demonstrates the political and cultural Americanization of what is a very quintessentially British sport. Focus has to be on equality of opportunity. I think that's the key. I think the state trying to facilitate the equalization of outcomes, in my view, is actually a very dangerous state. And I don't think that anyone on the left should support that. I also think there needs to be a limit. There needs to be a recognition that there are limits to what the British state can achieve. And that's why I talk about those concepts of personal responsibility, individual initiative, family duty is something that I talk about a great deal in the book, and trying your best to contribute positively to your own community. Because I think there is a tendency on certain elements of the left that they overestimate the ability of the state And I think that's hugely problematic. I think that I'm more humanitarian in my worldview. I think that there is a role for the state to play, but it should be more about coordinating and empowering families and communities to make progress in life. And I think that there's no form of government intervention. I think this was a point made very well in the SEAL report. There's no form of government intervention that can match the practical power and effectiveness of a stable family network. And I know that sounds very traditional, but I think that there's more people, there's a lot of people on the left that really need to recognize that. And crucially, I think that we need to make use of our long-standing institutions, which can be a force for good when it comes to social cohesion. One would be the royal family. As you know, that there are aggressively anti-monarchist sentiments on the left. But if you actually look at King Charles III, for example, he's referred to Britain as a community of communities. Even though he's the supreme governor of the Church of England, he's called himself the defender of all faiths. And I think if you have a traditional figurehead like that, who resides above conventional party politics, and he wholesomely embraces that diversity, which characterizes modern day Britain, I think that's a real national asset, if truth be told. And it's also a national asset that both the United States and France lacks, if I'm being completely honest. So I think that if I finish on this final point, a quite controversial one, I think many of my fellow leftists, you could say, they need to recognize that probably one of their strongest cultural allies is probably sits in Buckingham Palace. And I think that the key thing is you look at those traditional institutions, and if you want to strengthen social cohesion in the modern context, there's no harm in making use of the rich history and traditions which characterize Britain.
Very well put. It's been great to have you on today. For everyone that hasn't read the book, again, I really urge to go out and purchase it. Dr. Rakib, where can people find you in terms of following out what you're going to be
doing? Absolutely. So in terms of following me on Twitter, handle is RAKIBEHSAN, essentially my name. They can purchase the book Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities on Amazon, specifically Amazon Prime. So I think it should be next day delivery is available. And they can also visit my website if they want to gain more of a familiarity with my work and the research that I've done in the past. That's RAKIBEHSAN.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you for having me, Sunil.